one of the things that I personally have been doing over the last 15 years or so is traveling around the United States and looking at crop circles. I am the director of an organization called the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association. Archaeology is sort of my second hobby. And in looking at crop circles throughout the United States, we find that crop circles don't appear anywhere and everywhere, but crop circles tend to appear in conjunction with certain contextual features in the landscape. Over 95% of the crop circle formations that we've looked at in the Midwest appear with three things in the landscape. They appear near power lines, and in 85% of the cases, the formations that we surveyed, the closest pole, telephone pole or whatever, to the crop circle has a transformer box on it. Not all power line poles have transformer boxes on it, but an overwhelming correlation seems to find those near to where crop circles form. Second thing that we find is that crop circles appear in close conjunction with water. A creek, a pond, a drainage ditch, right over the top of an aquifer. And our last speaker, Glenn Broughton, actually probably was the one that first discovered that idea. He made a map of crop circle formations in England in the early 1990s, which showed that all the crop circles were locating along what's known as the green sand aquifer. And so that sort of became a very important clue as to what may be going on with crop circles. The third thing is that crop circles seem to appear on the downslope or the bottom of a hill or the lowest point of the field. The vast majority of crop circles do that. And in this case, this is the drainage area of the downslope of the hill. And so this crop circle was up in Canada that I investigated a few years ago. It had all of these pictured nicely all in one place. But the fourth correlation, which is pretty high, is that 65% of the crop circle formations have been located very close to Native American mounds and earthworks, or ancient archaeological sites. And we think that number is actually higher because so many mounds have been obliterated over the course of time. And so this piece right here is what we're going to talk about going forward here for the next few minutes. Now, as some people here may know from listening to Freddie's talk or listening to Glenn and Cameron or just your own general sort of knowledge about crop circles, is that the greatest number of crop circles every year that are reported are in southern England amid a landscape of earthworks such as Avebury, Silbury Hill, Stonehenge, Barbary Castle, and many, many others. Well, it turns out that the greatest number of crop circles reported in the United States each year also are being located amidst an ancient landscape of earthworks. Places like Seip Mound, the Great Miamisburg Mound, Serpent Mound, Fort Hill, and many, many others here. The highest concentration of crop circles reported has actually been in the state of Ohio, in the Ohio Valley, around where these earthworks are located. And this particular crop circle, which we'll get to near to the end, was very close to this Native American earthwork known as Seip Mound, and we'll talk about that later. Just to show you the similarities between the landscape in England and the landscape here, here's a picture of Silbury Hill, which is the largest intact man-made earthwork in all of Europe, and the Miamisburg Mound, which is not the largest of the earthworks, but it's the largest in the state of Ohio. And they're roughly similar in terms of shape and form, right? Stonehenge, we've heard a number of things about Stonehenge this weekend. It's been built with astronomical alignments encoded in it, and of course we just talked heavily about Serpent Mound and its astronomical alignments, but very similar sorts of ideas and concepts in terms of the earthworks and stuff. And one of the things that people don't really recognize about Stonehenge is the outer earthwork portion of it. You can see the circle and the avenue there. we see these kinds of large geometric earthwork circles and squares and octagons throughout the Ohio Valley. But just like in the first part of the talk, we use Serpent Mound as sort of a case study for our understanding of what's going on with these ancient sites. We're going to use this crop circle formation as sort of our keystone to understanding what the connection may be between the crop circles and these ancient sites. And so this crop circle appeared literally across the street from Serpent Mound back in 2003. And in the landscape here, here's Serpent Mound, here's Brush Creek, and if you remember the map, Brush Creek turns around and comes this direction, and Serpent Mound is right here, right on the top of that escarpment. There's a spring right over here, there are power lines. This, of course, is inside the crater, probably the only crop circle that's ever been reported inside of a meteorite crater. And one of the things that we know about this is that it's definitely not man-made. We did extensive scientific testing in this particular crop circle. I'm, again, a scientist by trade, so we go out and look at crop circles, and we do a bunch of different scientific tests on them. We will measure for the magnetic field strength. We will measure for the electric field strength. We'll measure for radioactivity. We will look at radio and microwave emissions. We will examine the plant structure to see if there are any changes to the plants. Sometimes we'll look at the magnetic content of the soil. And in this case, we can check the box on each one of those. Okay? I'm not going to go into all of the detail here. You can actually get this off of the iccra.org website. You can download a little PDF of the findings from the Serpent Mound crop circle. But all of this is just indicating that we found changes in the area of the crop circle, the flattened plants area, versus what we found outside of that in the field. One of the other things that we look at when we study crop circles is this was actually discovered by somebody that people may know in this audience. How many people remember Dr. Gerald Hawkins? Anybody? Handful of people. Dr. Gerald Hawkins, importantly, back in the early 1970s, was the guy that figured out all of the astronomical alignments encoded at Stonehenge. And he wrote several books about that. And in his later years, he started looking at crop circles. And one of the things that he found was that if there are a series of circles in the field of different sizes, you can take the diameter, measure the diameter of one and divide it into another, and you can get a mathematical ratio. And that those mathematical ratios weren't just any kind of ratio, they were very specific. They were diatonic ratios. And anybody know what a diatonic ratio is? Goes back to Pythagoras. Okay, diatonic ratios are essentially today known as sort of the musical intervals of the notes on a keyboard. So as you go from C to D, D to E, E to F, you get a series of notes. And so Serpent Mound actually encoded several diatonic ratios in it, and you could play those notes on a scale. And I didn't put the video in here, but if you go out to YouTube, just type in Serpent Mound crop circle, you'll get a video of my colleague Ted Robertson playing those notes on a harpsichord of both this crop circle and this crop circle, which came down right near the Miamisburg Mound, which I just showed a picture of on a previous slide. So you can listen to those, after you leave here today. Now, we've seen some of these geometric symbols, some of these sort of ancient knowledge symbols incorporated into the designs of crop circles around the world. And this particular one is encoding certain geometric principles in it. Ross mentioned that the Serpent Mound encoded the Vesica Pisces. Well, Serpent Mound also incorporates the Vesica Pisces. You can see that right here. It also incorporates a little-known figure known as the vesicula, which is this figure here. And this is on a ratio of 4 to 1.071798. So you have both of these ratios incorporated into the design of the central portion of it to kind of create that sort of cat's eye image of the central area. And you can also use that sort of two-crescent circle in understanding higher mathematics. The Vesica Piscis, for instance, incorporates the square root of 2, the square root of 3, the square root of 5, and so on. So you can get higher order mathematics derived from that sacred geometry. Now, you can also look at this design and see that it's based on the principle of that sort of flower of life geometric symbol. And so you're seeing step by step the stages of what you would consider to be the geometric lessons as you go along, as you incorporate your understanding of these geometric principles. Now, you can look at various components of this particular crop circle design, and one specific one is this crescent. Now, this isn't just any kind of a crescent, because there's a crescent right above it, and there are two crescents right there. But this is a very specific kind of crescent. It's called a lunula. And a lunula has been known since ancient times as a tool to help you determine the positioning of stars in the sky. And it's still being used today. Here's a modern one. It's called a planisphere. And you can rotate it around for your day of the year, and it'll change the stars that are in the sky for your location. And so we see this sort of commonality of there's something going on here with this crop circle that's telling us to kind of look at the sky. Now, Cameron Broughton in the previous talk mentioned the idea of squaring the circle. And she said, oh, I wish I had a picture of it. Well, here's one right here, and here's another one right here. I had met a geometer who subsequently became a friend of mine. His name is Alan Brown. We were both speaking at a conference together a few years ago, and Alan Brown was looking at a very specific type of crop circle in England known as a Celtic cross pattern, which is essentially like 5 circles like on a dice, right? You know, you roll dice and you have a little 5 on it. 5 little circles. And one of the things that he found, based on an idea from another crop circle researcher, Michael Glickman, was that these 5 circles may exhibit this idea of squaring the circle. Now, this idea of squaring the circle is a problem that dates, it's like a philosophical problem that dates back to the time of the Egyptians at least. And it's to construct a square from the perimeter distance of a circle. Now, sounds like Ross got a dog in the background. I know Ross doesn't have a dog, he has cats, so it must be from outside of his house. And this, this figure of squaring the circle from the earliest days of the Egyptians to the modern day when Alan Brown started looking at these Celtic cross patterns in England was such that there were only 6 known ways of approximately squaring the circle. It turns out that pi is an irrational number, so you can't actually get an actual square, but you can get very close, better than 99% accuracy using 6 different methods. Well, when Alan Brown started looking at these crop circles, Celtic cross patterns in England, which were appearing in the 1980s, he found that he could find new ways of squaring the circle that had never been seen previously. And so he then found approximately 50 new ways that had never been seen before of squaring the circle based on looking at the geometry of these Celtic cross patterns in England. And so when this crop circle, after I investigated and we measured it out, I sent in the diagram and I said, well, there's the central circle and there are 4 circles on the outside. This is a Celtic cross pattern. Can you, apply your methodology and look at it? And it does square the circle in 2 ways. And I don't have time to go through all the steps, so forgive me, but These are actually slightly different based on the placements of these outer circles. But there's what he calls his simple squared circle solution and a tangential squared circle solution. And the first one is 99.6% accurate, and the second one is 99.98% accurate. Now, you get this sort of final reconstruction of it, and then you got to go out to the field and lay it out, right? So think about that for a moment. Now, the idea of squaring the circle as a philosophical concept, Dr. Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, remarked on it. He said that the squaring of the circle is one of the many archetypal motifs which form the basic patterns of our dreams and fantasies. And from the functional point of view, it could be called the archetype of wholeness. Now, the quaternity of the one is what Jung described as the schema of all images of God. It's seen in the Bible, Ezekiel, Daniel, Enoch, even in Egyptian mythology of Horus with the 4 sons. And this quaternity of the one is related to the squaring of the circle, and it's described as a motif of 4, of 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, which is offset somehow differently. And it's also described as having a dark half and a light half. And if you look at that vesicula in the center, it's split right down the middle as having a dark half and a light half. Now, Jung says that symbolically, lightning depicts an overpowering change in the psychic condition associated with the quaternity, and that this is a transformative process. In that transformation, Mercurius, the animal spirit, arises in the fire flash into the prima materia, or the primal substance of existence of the divine essence of God, like a fiery serpent. And this is where the divine innermost birth of the soul takes place. Remember what Ross was talking about. This is the cinnabar stage of transformation. Now, cinnabar, in its olden sort of European language, was known as the Ouroboros dragon, the Sanguis draconis, or the dragon's blood, which is related to the Philosopher's Stone. Now, in the Philosopher's Stone sleeps the animal spirit Mercurius, which is also known as the circle of the moon and the round and the square. Now, Jung talks about in this transformative process, there comes to be a turning point, an illuminating, transforming, fertilizing part of the process, and that the snake is the necessary part of the process of growth. Now, Serpent Mound, if you go back to thinking about what the Hopewell levels of cosmology were, Serpent Mound is analogous to the great horned serpent, or the underwater panther of Hopewell cosmology. The horned serpent was a spirit being connected to curing, medicine, and mythology, and it was a powerful underground Manitou that was the guardian spirit of many Native Americans and liked to reside in rocks near water. Now, traditionally, the God of Revelation, and that's lower R, not Bible revelation, but traditionally, the God of Revelation has the form of a snake, e.g. the agathodaimon, or the good daemon encircling the equal cross. Now, the agathodaimon was the pupil or teacher, depending on which mythology you read, of Hermes or Mercurius, and to the Greeks was considered to be the guardian of the vines and the cornfields. Now, if we look at another portion of the crop circle formation that appeared near Serpent Mound, one portion of it, that one offset by itself, had a ring around it. And that ring had a little tiny widening in its pathway. Well, that widening is a symbolic representation of the Ouroboros, or the Ouroboros dragon, the Sanguis draconis. Serpent Mound itself is an analog for the constellation of Draco. We're seeing these same themes repeat over and over and over again. between the crop circle design and the Serpent Mound formation. So let's examine this sort of Thunderbird-serpent connection a little bit more. A few years ago, as a scientist, we've been studying crop circles from this sort of very, as Ross termed it, exogenic sort of way of looking at things. And it's really a sort of limiting worldview, right? Science is sort of has its boundaries. Well, I decided that I would start to apply different sort of methods of thought, including ancient Native American methods of thought, to our understanding of crop circles to see if we could gain some sort of better understanding of what's going on with crop circles. And I came upon this idea between the serpent and the Thunderbird. Now, the Thunderbird, dating back as far as people started documenting the mythologies of various Native American tribes, has been connected to the horned serpent, but there are also a whole sort of series of mythologies that are unto the Thunderbird itself. But that the Thunderbird is considered to be something like a god in the shape of a great eagle that feeds upon serpents, which it takes from under the earth. Now, the Ojibwa believe that the Thunderbird from time to time sets forth into different parts of the world to search for serpents, and that when you see a thunderbolt strike a tree, a lightning striking a tree, the Indians believe that the Thunderbird had shot its fiery arrow at the serpent through its eyes, and that it was attempting to get the serpent. Now, this legend was ritually reenacted amongst various Native American tribes as part of an earth renewal process, and that they believe that this process happened on an annual basis. So it turns out that the Midewiwin, which is an Algonquin sort of secret society, considered the Thunderbird as a messenger to the spirit world, and that the Thunderbird lived in the four quarters. Remember our quartering of time and space concept, and that they are the messengers of the four winds, and that there were always four of them. Now, while all things in nature move clockwise, the Thunderbird is said to move counterclockwise. And I came across this, this artifact from the west coast of the United States, which, if you look at the face of it, this is actually a whorl. You stick a string through the middle of it, and you wind it up, and you spin it. And it makes the Thunderbird look like that. Now, if you look at that image for a moment, you'll notice that that is the identical appearance to the hourglass effect that we see in crop circles on the landscape. You'll see as they're spun flat, they exhibit this hourglass shape. Now, at the lunch break, I ran up to my room and I threw in 3 additional slides, because in the first morning talk of Glenn Kreisberg, he showed this picture, and he didn't really talk about why that is important. This comes from an archaeologist by the name of Herman Bender up in Wisconsin. And Herman Bender has been looking at effigy mounds and petroform sites up in the state of Wisconsin. And this comes from a place known as the Kolterman site. Now, the Kolterman site was important because when Herman Bender looked at it, he found that the effigy mounds which are here, which are earthworks placed in the landscape in the shape of animals, they overlaid this older stone figure in the landscape. Now, they also found there that one of the stones had a petroglyph inscription on it in the shape of a thunderbird. So Herman Bender was pretty intrigued, and he looked at it, and it turns out to be a combination of the constellations of Scorpius and Libra combined. And this little red one right in the center is actually where the planet Mars goes through that constellation on a yearly basis. Now, they didn't just lay it out, they laid it out as a mirror image. Remember, as above, reflected below. It's a mirror image of it, and they got the colors of the stones to match the colors of the stars in the sky. So when you go out into the landscape, in these forested areas in the East Coast or anywhere you find these stones in the landscape, don't move the stones. Because you're going to lose this kind of information. Don't move the stones. Now, it turns out that that figure of the constellation of Libra and Scorpius combined in Native American lore is a figure known as the star being. And that star being was considered to be the harbinger of the annual return of the Thunderbirds. So when that figure arose in the sky in the spring, the Native Americans knew that the Thunderbirds were going to return. Okay? It's a very important sort of mythological figure. Well, it turns out this Kolterman site, I don't have time to go into all of it, but the Kolterman site was the location whereby we had the report of the last crop circle eyewitnessed by someone. Back in 2003, 2 months before the Serpent Mound crop circle came down by Serpent Mound, a crop circle came down right near the Kolterman Petroform site, and a guy actually watched it go down. Not man-made. 3 different circles swirled down in about 12 seconds. We have pictures of it at the table in the back if you want to look at it, or if you go out to iccra.org, you can see that crop circle there. Now, what's that?
Is that Art Rentella?
Yes, Art Rentella. Art Rentella was the eyewitness. Now, interestingly enough, this idea of Scorpius and Libra combined, in literally and symbolically in its relationship with Orion in the sky, reenacts the movement of the Thunderbirds. The Thunderbirds were said to move from northeast to south, from northwest to southeast across the landscape. And that's exactly how these constellations move in the sky. So they follow that, and at the end of that is when you have that great Earth renewal ceremony. Now, of course, the Native Americans did not connect the star patterns like what we've been saying throughout the evening, the modern constellations that we're talking about of Scorpius and Libra and Draco. They connected the dots differently. They had their own sort of star asterisms in the sky. Constellations were fixed actually fairly recently based on older traditions. The modern constellations, the 88 of them that are known, were sort of agreed upon by astronomers at the International Astronomical Union meeting in 1931. That's somewhat modern, right? So a bunch of constellations that you see when you open up these star books and stuff are actually sort of modern inventions. There were older traditions of constellations that were quite a bit different than modern constellations that we know today. And the Native Americans, of course, connected the dots wholly differently. The Chinese connected the dots wholly differently. You go to different cultures around the world that were isolated from one another, and they essentially connected the dots differently. But that the stories attached to some of those are somewhat related to one another. Now, it turns out that the constellation of Draco, according to the Lakota, who in their past moved from the Ohio Valley. They moved from ancient times from the Ohio Valley up into Wisconsin, and then from Wisconsin out to the Western Plains states. And the Lakota regarded the Thunderbird as Draco. Okay? So think about that for a second. Register that in your mind. remember Serpent Mound being laid out like the constellation of Draco. And go back to your Hopewell cosmology. Above is the Thunderbird. Below is the Great Horned Serpent. And where they meet, where Serpent Mound sits on our plane of existence, is the connecting point. So the fact that you have a serpent and a Thunderbird combined in that stellar image is exactly what that message of the form of Serpent Mound seems to be intending to represent in one aspect, right? So when we look at these sort of two iconic figures, the Great Horned Serpent and the Thunderbird, this is an actual artifact, a shell medallion essentially that people wore at one point, carved that mythology right into that artifact. But that the Thunderbirds would start off in the northwest in the spring, and then they'd move to the southeast later in the summer in their quest to kill the Great Horned Serpent. And the only way to kill the Great Horned Serpent was to shoot that fiery arrow through the head of the serpent. And that action of shooting the fiery arrow through the head of the serpent was the earth renewal ritual, okay? Now, if we go back to our diagram, here's the crop circle of Serpent Mound with its 4 circles surrounding the central point. Here is Serpent Mound right here. And that crop circle formation was aligned through the head of the serpent, ritually reenacting symbolically the earth renewal ceremony ritual. Okay? You see the same themes repeated over and over again. So this is like a case study of how you look at what is this ancient knowledge coming through? How does it relate to us today? We're seeing it played out in the landscape on an everyday basis. You have to change your frame of reference and get away from Western civilization thought to be able to begin to comprehend it. We've heard that from Freddie, we've heard it from Glenn and Cameron. You have to change your thinking to be able to comprehend the knowledge that is being given to us. It turns out that when you look at this, this is, I've overlaid the crop circle into Google Earth, and there's, going back to our original image, Serpent Mound is on that escarpment up on top, and you can see what that alignment is. It turns out that if you go back to the day that the crop circle occurred, and you wait for nightfall, that night, rising above the crop circle, using our lumula from the crop circle, there is Draco right in the sky, on that alignment. And if you look at that alignment, you can look at it as the Thunderbird or Draco. If you flip the alignment around and you look at it from the opposite direction, there is Libra and Scorpius combined. So not only do you get this sort of fixed point in time and space, you have the connection between the earth and the sky. Now, as amazing as all that is, that's half the story, right? So it turns out that that crop circle, like everything else, is not isolated by itself in the landscape, but is part of a series of crop circles that occurred in the landscape that year across about a 60-mile area. There were 4 crop circles in 2003. We effectively, affectionately call it the line, all right, that were aligned in the landscape. They created roughly a straight line. Now, the following summer, there was another line across the Ohio landscape from the Miamisburg Mound stretching down to West Virginia that incorporated 5 different sites. And in 2005, we found that there were a whole series of crop circles that occurred that connected to that West Virginia line in the summer of 2005. Now, when we heard about the first crop circles in 2005 in North Carolina, I started plotting them on a map, and remember what Glenn said, alignments 2, you can draw any 2 and connect them. 3 is interesting. 4, you've really got something, right? So here we had 3 that had been reported. So we got in an airplane and we flew the line. And we found 2 additional crop circles by flying the line that had not been reported. So we used it as a sort of diagnostic tool to help us find more crop circles in the landscape. Now, when you put these all together, they don't make any sort of big pattern that we really know about, except that these 2 portions of the line, they create this 90-degree angle in the landscape. And one of the speakers tomorrow, I think, Beth Hagins, I ran into her at Serpent Mound a few years ago. She said, hey, you got to read this book. Let me give this to you, called The Gaia Matrix, which she helped to contribute to. And the Gaia Matrix is this idea that there is this worldwide sort of grid of energy. Now, it turns out that Peter Champeau, the author of that, put together this idea that there is something known as the Great Cross of North America, essentially 2 big lines across the landscape that intersect, and it turns out that this is pretty well on 2 of the arms of the Great Cross of North America. And you can go to Peter's site and read about the Great Cross of North America and those energy lines. Now, I mentioned the Miamisburg mound and the crop circle that appeared near it, and this is that, that crop circle. Now, that was aligned in the landscape right to the mound itself, and all of the circles except 1 lined up perfectly, and we actually used this green laser to test that. We went out at night, had one person stand next to each of the central stalks of each of the circles in that crop circle formation. If I go back to that for a second, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 circles essentially. In each of these, this cornfield, this is a cornfield, maize corn. In each of these circles, there was 1 single standing stalk at the center of those crop circles. And we got on a ladder and we went out there at night and we shone the laser along this alignment, pointed right to the Miamisburg mound. Everybody saw the beam. You can see this pretty good at night. If I shine it over there, you can see the green beam pretty well. Except this circle. It was offset from the rest of them, and it bugged the heck out of me. I really just couldn't figure out why. This is an actual Google Earth image. If you go to, for those that have Google Earth, you can actually go in time back to that date, and you can look in this field and see the remnant of that formation. I got it pictured up here at the same angle. But that it was offset. The blue line is offset from the red line just slightly. Now, I'm unhappy to report that this field no longer exists. The local Miamisburg School District built a high school right over the top of this field. So you'll never see another crop circle near the Miamisburg again. It was the last remaining close field to it. Everything else is all developed around it. You have subdivisions and everything else. But if we follow this line, it takes us across the Ohio landscape and goes right here to a place called Bainbridge, Ohio, and it goes right to the center of one of the 2003 aligned crop circles. This is on an island in a river. It was not visible from any road. It was actually spotted by a pilot who helped fly me over the Serpent Mound crop circle and called me up a couple weeks later and said, hey, there's another one. And so this is the red line of the 2003 alignments, goes through the center of one of the circles, and it creates, again, this 90-degree angle. Now, if we look at this a little closer up, this was in soybeans, like the crop circle near Serpent Mound, and it has sort of 3 sort of distinct symbols, a circle, a triangle, and this other figure. Now, I sent this to my friend, a crop circle geometer by the name of Bert Jansen, and he did some geometric analysis on it for me. And he wrote about it in his book, his most recent book, and he actually, in his final chapter, said that he'd been studying crop circles in the Netherlands and in England and throughout Europe and from a geometric point of view. And that this crop circle, which he never visited, was one of the 2 most favorite crop circles that he ever had of all time, because this crop circle incorporates every single geometric principle that he ever learned in studying geometry from crop circles. Now, it turns out that this crop circle is aligned to this mound, which I mentioned earlier in my talk, called the Seip Mound, Earthworks. And in ancient times, it was an enormous complex of a circle, a square, and a circle-square figure combination, right? It also turns out that there was a crop circle in this valley back in 3 years prior to this one, which was also aligned to the ancient earthwork. Now, when you look at the Seip Mound Earthworks, this is a 3D model of it that was done by the Ohio Historical Society. You have actually 3 levels in the landscape that this is built on. This is analogous to the 3 Hopewell levels of cosmology. And it turns out when you read the mythology, the square is related to the serpent. The people gather at the square ground to see the snake man. That's from an actual Creek legend. The circle is representative of the sky beings, and where you have the circle and square come together into 2, that's the point that you can interface. And it turns out when they excavated this huge mound, there were 2 construction buildings that were connected by a little hallway, 2 different ones, mirroring this: if you're in one, you're in the square; if you're in the other, you're in the circle. So they built their constructions and then later built mounds on top of that as sort of this memorial to this thing. Now, if you look at where Seip Mound Earthworks is in the landscape, just follow the valley up the Haint Creek, you come to another circle, square, circle combination known as the Baum Earthworks, and this is one of my LiDAR maps. And one of the things that you find is that it reveals that these 2 earthworks were not just placed at random in the landscape, but they actually are laid out on a huge grid system. And you can see how they're connected if I put the grid lines out on the landscape. If you measure the square and you just lay those squares end to end to end to end, it turns out that they're identically placed. So there's a specific unit of measure that was used on a grid to lay these ancient sites out. And it turns out that you can go from Seip Mound to Baum, and you can go from Baum to Seip Mound in a reverse way on a shifted grid. It works either way, doesn't matter. So you can see how those squares are lined up. So we're seeing this sort of repetitive idea of this ancient geometry laid out, the mirroring of earth and sky down to this specific on our plane of existence sort of connecting point. Now, if you look at that crop circle design, it's what I call harmonically balanced. Each of the elements within this crop circle relate to other elements, almost like ripples in a pond, right? You can see that being reflected by the different sizes of the circles and how they interact with each other. Remember what Freddie Silva said about that sort of resonance, the morphic field, those ripples in the pond sort of moving out amongst one another. Now, when you look at those 3 different pieces, the circle with an arm connected to it is an actual Native American symbol, which was found on birch bark scrolls that were possessed by the Midewiwin. And when they talked about it with ethnologists, it was translated to mean that which I live upon has been put on this dish by the spirit. That was back in 1885. Now, the triangle was noted as far back as 1634 among the Jesuit, which is another secret society of the Ojibwa. the French explorer Lejeune was told by the Jesuit that triangles were symbols of air spirits and an indicator of the source of life. Now, this symbol very specifically has been seen repeatedly in petroglyph drawings, and it's the symbol of the Thunderbird. Now, this was found as far back as 1888, noted by Garrick Mallory. So, we have our alignment to Seip Mound, we have our alignment to the 2003 formations, and it just kept eating at me. What about this one? Well, it turns out that if you follow that little straight line component off into the landscape, you eventually hit another crop circle. And this is in a place called Paulding, Ohio, and it turned out that was the very first crop circle I ever investigated, back in 1996. Now, what's amazing about that is that straight line component pointed across the landscape to another crop circle got me really excited, because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. Nobody ever reported on anything like that before. And I started checking, because I've been mapping crop circles for a while. So I started looking at lots and lots of other crop circles, and it turns out every single crop circle that I've managed to map in the United States that had some straight line geometric component to it points to another crop circle. And in some cases, those straight line components actually interlock with one another. So you have one straight line component points to another straight line component in the landscape across hundreds and hundreds of miles, in some cases thousands of miles. The farthest one that I mapped was about 1,800 miles. Now, the most amazing one, I don't have time to go into any of those, except I'll show you one. And that was in this place called Madisonville, Tennessee, back in May 2007. It was two Celtic cross formations, like superimposed upon one another. And that created a series of straight line lines out in the landscape. And each of them are aligned across the landscape. Here's the formation, and you have all of these straight lines plus the triangle in the center. And they all point to a different crop circle, except these two point to nearby earthwork mounds. And turns out that the triangle also points to 3 different crop circles, and another crop circle on the landscape in Montana, its straight line component comes back and hits this right in the center. Now, this is sort of the map of that. They fan out across the landscape, and you hit other crop circles in earthworks throughout the landscape. So what we're seeing is that all the crop circle formations seem to have this sort of self-referencing aspect to it. And that some formations are aligned repeatedly to one another. Now, if I go back to this slide, Madisonville happened in 2007. Now, I had kind of stumbled upon this in 2009, and I went back and was mapping them with my historical database. It turns out that not only do these crop circles reference historical crop circles, they reference crop circles which have not yet happened in the landscape. They point to where future crop circles will occur, because we found that as we mapped them, that they pointed to ones that had not yet happened at the time that the formation occurred. Now, that brings up a whole series of questions, right? Many of which have no answer at this point. What we do know is that the observation brings up 3 sort of key questions. One, were all the crop circles planned out in advance, and they're slowly unfolding across time and space? Or 2, do the crop circles appear at nodal points of some underlying geometric grid of energy? And 3, are there additional forces acting upon where and when crop circles form that we have yet to consider? Remember, I only figured this out because I had the mapping technology to be able to do that. That mapping technology did not exist prior to 2005. So all of those historical crop circles in England, dating back to the 1980s, none of that stuff was mapped. None of those researchers figured this out because the technology was not there to be able to do it. So as we progress, as new technologies come out, what are we yet to find from these historical formations that we do not yet know? It's an important question to consider. So we go back to this idea of the return of the Thunderbirds. Now, the medicine man lame deer suggests that the power of trance is connected to the power of the Thunderbird. And it is a paradoxical state of consciousness. It ties into the paradoxical energy of thunder and lightning. And he says that it's in such paradoxical states that people assimilate new information quickly without filtering. Now, the Agala Indian black elk says that when a vision comes from the thunder beings of the West, it comes with a terror like a thunderstorm. But when the storm of vision is past, the world is greener and happier. For whenever the truth of vision comes upon the world, it is like a rain. The world, you see, is happier after the terror of the storm. Now, Serpent Mound is a repository of knowledge and a sacred facility for the initiation into the mysteries of the Logos. Events and physical changes are governed by intrinsic proportions, periodicities, and measures, and that these characteristics seem to have been recognized by our ancestors and used to create these structural technologies. The earthworks in the Ohio Valley constitute a cosmological structure that marries the earth and the sky to harness that energy. The energy was tapped to use that power of the landscape and the sky together, and that the appearance of crop circles in the modern day in the landscape near the earthworks suggests that these effects are still intact and continuing to take place. And what we are being shown to us are not just new ways of knowing, but also the old ways of knowing. And thank you very much. We'll let Ross have his final word. Ross, are you still there? Did we lose him? Let's see if he's there.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
There you go.
All right. What Jeff said. What Jeff said. The summary was right on. My background suggests that we're right at the nexus of a major shift in consciousness that's maybe going to happen in 2012, but starting perhaps next year, starting perhaps right now. This knowledge is only going to become exponential, and we will be able to focus in on how we can restore paradise. And we're working with Native people, and we're spending a lot of time at Native sites to try to inculcate this knowledge. And join us, come to Serpent Mound next year and hang out with us. Thank you.
We're just a few minutes over our time, but I'd be happy to take questions if you want to sacrifice your dinner time. Somebody has another mic or not? No? I see somebody with sort of like a red shirt. Oh, hi, Jennifer.
Have you read any of Paul LaViolette's work called Decoding the Pulsars and his thoughts and ideas about these possible electromagnetic energy being sent from the past, like light can travel huge tremendous speeds and microwaves even faster?
I've read some of LaViolette's earlier work, Earth Under Fire, but not what you're talking about.
The newer book suggests possibly there's a correlation between cultures on other planets trying to send us information about the importance of pulsars to protect us from solar flares, and it could be manifesting on crop circles in ancient sites.
Well, as Glenn Kreisberg noted in his presentation this morning, the book Hamlet's Mill, he didn't really talk about why that book is so important. It's actually hugely important amongst people that study ancient mythologies and how they relate to patterns in the sky. And what von Deschen found was that, and De Santillana, the two authors, was that all of these sort of ancient mythologies found sort of the world over were obsessed or had a focus on the idea of precession, of the precession of the equinoxes. Ross sort of talked about it in an oblique way, but that the Earth's rotation is on an axis, and that axis points out at the poles, out into space. This is one at the South Pole, one at the North Pole. And that North Pole, when it shoots out into space, it's called the North Celestial Pole, and it points out to what we said was Thuban back the time the Egyptians built the pyramids. Today it's Polaris. And the reason that it's changed is because the Earth is on this slight little wobble, and it moves across the sky and goes from one place to another and carves out a big circle in the sky, and that's called the precession of the equinoxes. And that takes about 26,000 years for that cycle to occur. If you live long enough and you remember as a little child going out and looking at the North Star, by the time you're 72 or so, that will have moved about 1 degree in a 360-degree circle. That's how long it takes to actually see the effects of precession. So you had to have generations upon generations upon generations of people passing down where that star was to understand precession, and then to incorporate it in with those oral traditions and mythologies to pass that along to people. And that's what Hamlet's Mill is about. And that's why that book was kind of critically important. It came out, 20 plus, 30 plus years ago. And it's very little known. And it's a very dense read, very, very difficult read, which is why most people haven't ever read it or heard of it. But, that's kind of what that looks like. We have another question? Yeah, someone straight back.
Given the relationship you found between different crop circles, do you think that you'll be able to predict where crop circles may appear in the future from now?
That's a very difficult question. What I would say is that although we managed to sort of hit on the finding 2 crop circles in 2005 by flying the alignment, we don't get an alignment every year. Also, in looking at where we've mapped the crop circles to find where they point to other crop circles, and then looking at other straight line components that don't seem to point to anywhere, that could predict where other crop circles would occur. But crop circles are really rare. They're exceedingly rare. For those people that aren't really aware of that fact, in the United States, there are about 20 million farmers. And on the average, over the past 20 years, there have been about 20 crop circles reported each year in the United States. So your chances of getting a crop circle on your property are about 1 in a million. You hit the crop circle lottery if you're a farmer and you get one on your property. It's very challenging to make a prediction as to where a crop circle will come down. And I would not be presumptuous enough to try and attack that. What we could do is sort of diagnostically locate them after the fact, though. And also, by the way, this database of the mapping, we have not given it out to the general public for a very specific reason, and that is, and Freddie Silva will tell you this, they have a serious hoaxing problem in England. There are teams of hoaxers going out and making all kinds of patterns. And I can only imagine that they would use that for sort of devious purposes. They would take that database and say, oh, well, here's one that's not aligned today. Let's go out on that alignment and make one. So we're keeping this sort of close to the vest and talking about it without revealing the details of all of that stuff. So, yeah.
Did the crop circles like the one you have there with the serpent?
Yeah,
mound where
I cut all that for time, but actually, that is definitely the case. The earliest, one of the earliest, actually the two earliest records that we have in the United States, you can go out to iccra.com to look at those references. The earliest one was from the 1820s, and the second one was from 1847, I believe, 1847 or 1849. And there's actually a Native American mythology called the magic circle in the prairie. And it was collected back in the 1840s by a guy by the name of Henry Schoolcraft, who traveled out to the western states, West Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and actually married an Ojibwa woman and spent the rest of his life in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and collected ethnographically the stories and the mythologies from those tribes and sent them to Congress. He was an employee of the Bureau of Ethnology. And in a report to Congress in 1847, he had one of his stories was called The Magic Circle in the Prairie. It talks about this Native American brave walking through the prairie grass, and he comes upon this flattened circle without any pathways leading to or from it. And then he's bewildered by it, and he can't figure out what it is, and then goes on to have all kinds of sort of magical adventures as a result of it. So that's one of the early Native American stories about crop circles. Yes?
Yes, I've been studying stonework in New England for about 20 years. I just wrote an article for Ancient American Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And in my study, I found many records of giants in New England and Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
Adena burial sites, Adena artifacts, but 7- and 8-foot skeletons with double rows of teeth in the town histories.
Yeah, the Lenni Lenape people, the ancient Allegheny peoples, the Adena people, actually moved from the Ohio area out to New Jersey. And there are a whole series of these sites in southern New Jersey and part of the East Coast that the Lenni Lenape have actual records of, and that there were those giants buried in those mounds.
And
Right.
Martha's Vineyard, 7-foot double rows of teeth.
Right.
Middleborough, 7, 8. And I was wondering, do you think, my thought is that were the mound builders, the stone builders of New England, did they move into New England and have?
It's very possible. Obviously, the boundary is, the mountains, right? And you can cross the mountains. So it's a continuous area, right? I mean, people in Europe didn't stop, going to Asia. They just walked across the landscape and went to Asia. Same thing here. People in North America traveled all across North America. The Hopewell in a lot of these sites have artifacts that come from all across North America. At the actual Hopewell site, the type site, they found obsidian from Yellowstone Park. They had shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They had mica from North Carolina. They had copper from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. They traveled all around. And those networks and trading areas don't just travel to carry artifacts, they carry information. And so it's not surprising that we would see this being carried across all of North America into South America probably. Right? Mm-hmm. Someone directly behind.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, you got somebody right there?
I have
Okay.
a question about squaring the circle.
Yes.
I think there's a semantic problem here. The classical problem of the Greek, there were 3 of them, trisecting an angle, doubling a cube, and the third one was squaring a circle. But that particular problem refers to, given a circle, you're allowed to use only a compass and a straight edge for marking.
That's correct, yes.
And you have to construct a square whose area, not circumference.
You can use it either way.
But I don't, the Greek problem did not address the perimeter, it addressed the area.
Right, but you can use it either way. It's interchangeable.
But not, that isn't really true.
Well,
You prove mathematically that you cannot do the first one, the one that I say, using only the straight edge and the compass, using cubic equation, you can show that it cannot be done.
Well, neither can be done because pi is an irrational number. You can't use the circumference or the area. So both are irrational, and so you can't ever truly square the circle. But you can become close, and you're right. The method is you can only use a compass and a straight edge, essentially, to solve for that.
So the idea is to be exact as impossible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Don't hear your microphone.
Soil, if where something will grow and something will not, in the crop circle.
I can't hear your question, I'm sorry.
Hello, can you hear that?
Yes, barely.
The examination of the soil, between where something will grow and where something will not, in the crop circle.
I'm not understanding what your question is.
Well, have people, I'm sure people have examined the soil,
Yes.
and what makes a crop circle is that things will grow in certain areas.
There doesn't appear to be a connection there. Crop circles appear in the landscape where there are those certain contextual features, but it doesn't have anything to do with the soil fertility. People are growing crops in that area. The crops don't die because the circle occurs there.
Is there crops still growing in the circle?
Yes, the plants do not die. They continue to grow in many cases over time. Depends on the time of the season or the stage of growth that the plants, when they're flat and when that occurs, is dependent on whether or not the crops will return upright or not. Sometimes they'll start to reorient themselves with the sun. That process starts about 24 hours after the plants are flattened. So if the plants are still green and still growing, they will begin to reorient themselves. If they're at late stage harvest where the plants have already dried out and they're flattened, when the wheat turns yellow or the corn turns brown, they will not reorient themselves because it's already at harvest time.